taught by Jesus that leaves us feeling as if grace allows people to get by with things. But grace doesn't dumb down sin to make it more palatable. Grace doesn't have to. Grace acknowledges the full implication of sin and yet does not condemn. Grace is understood best within the context of relationship. After all, it is only within the mystery and complexity of relationships that grace is experienced. So it seemed to me that the best way to approach this subject would be to simply tell the story of grace. It is a story that begins in the beginning. It is a story that traces its way through every book of the Old and New Testaments. The story of grace includes a broad range of characters, rich, poor, powerful, and powerless. In each chapter, we will parachute into the life of a biblical character at a time when his or her future hung in the balance. For all of them, it is God's grace that tips the scale in their favor. In the process, we will discover that in some ways, these stories are our stories. For like the individuals who populate the pages of Scripture, we too need grace. But not just any grace, the grace of God. Chapter 1. In the beginning, grace. Grace has been the basis of our relationship with our Creator from the very beginning. First-time Bible readers are often struck by the apparent contrast between the God we discover in the Old Testament and God as explained by Jesus in the New. To be candid, even people very familiar with the Bible often struggle with this contrast. Several years ago, my wife, Sandra, studied the Old Testament as part of a course that required students to read straight through the historical books, Joshua through 2 Chronicles. Like many longtime Christians, she grew up with a devotional approach to Bible reading, so most of the better-known stories were familiar, but she had never read straight through the narrative portions of the Old Testament. Early one morning, I walked in on her while she was reading, and she looked up at me and said, "I'll be glad when I'm finished with this." "Really?" I said. "Why?" She shook her head and said, "This isn't how I view God. Basically, He condones genocide." Genocide. That term had recently taken on new meaning for us. 3 months earlier, we had visited Rwanda. We talked to survivors. We visited the Genocide Museum in Kigali. Horrific photographs and video footage of the carnage revealed the evil that had plunged this African country into darkness for 100 days, during which at least 500,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered. Piles of bodies, mass graves, heaps of skulls. Children who survived were left orphaned and homeless. We also saw the instruments of destruction. The drunken civilian death squads known as Interahamwe preferred the machete, a weapon that created carnage of Old Testament proportions. After experiencing that somber, haunting place, we cannot speak the word genocide without feeling sick. Sandra was right. The parallels were too obvious to ignore. In his book, The God Delusion, noted atheist Dr. Richard Dawkins declared, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." But he isn't the first to draw such conclusions. In the 2nd century, Bishop Marcion was so struck by the contrast between descriptions of the God in the Old and New Testaments, he concluded they must refer to different beings altogether. He believed the God of the Old Testament created the physical world and introduced the law, which was based on retribution through Judaism. Whereas Marcion characterized the Old Testament God as a cruel and jealous lawgiver, he saw the New Testament God as a compassionate and loving Father who was concerned about all mankind. He believed this New Testament God revealed Himself through Jesus Christ. While the church in Marcion's day considered his teaching heretical and eventually excommunicated him, one can't help but appreciate his attempt to reconcile the apparent contradictions between God as presented in the Old and New Testaments, the God of war versus the kinder, gentler God who sent His Son to redeem the world from sin. With all that in mind, it would seem that a study of grace should begin with the Gospel of Matthew. On the surface, it appears that the birth of Jesus